So I thought I'd follow up on one of the videos I shot a couple days ago, and it was on the future of science and religion, and I wanted to say just a couple more things about that and see if I can't maybe talk a little bit about Stoicism and how the Stoic worldview fits into that. Okay, so one of the claims, and I want to support this claim. I want to get people involved in this discussion, which is, could consciousness have not been? And I've tried to say that rather than people haggling about the characteristic of God and what characteristics does God have, or is there not a God, and do you have justified true beliefs about the divine, just move to the question of, could consciousness have not been? And I guess I want to say that from my own perspective, it couldn't have not been. And when I say that consciousness couldn't have not been, I'm trying to say that there is an orderliness to the cosmos such that consciousness is a fulfillment and a development of one of its inherent potentialities. That is, one of the inherent potentialities of the cosmos was to have a consciousness that experiences the depth and the range and the kind of complexity of the matter that's there. And I guess it's trying to account for the structure and the orderliness, say, of mathematics in the world, but then also how that relates to the emergence of a consciousness that could recognize that orderliness. Now, if I say that consciousness couldn't have not been, and that nature evolved free beings, but nature didn't choose to evolve beings who would experience choice, but we have been fated to that experience. And so when you get to the individual level, so like when I say that when you look back at your own past and you look at your own life, and your own life couldn't, when you look at your own past and you imagine that you could have done otherwise, what you're doing is you're imagining that you weren't there. And it doesn't mean that your life is determined. No, the way that your life is determined is that you were determined to experience agency and choice. And nature evolved organisms somehow. I mean, the expression is it's a weird grammar. Nature evolved organisms. I mean, I don't think nature chose by conscious intention to, or life didn't choose by conscious intention to emerge self-reflexive conscious beings. It was a necessary fulfillment of one of the potentialities, right? One of the potentialities of this cosmos was reflection back upon itself, and to various degrees. And so sentience itself, and awareness and life, and whether or not there would be the kind of human existence that we know with the imagination and the memory and all these other kinds of facets, those to me are very different than could human emergence, what we're talking about, with the alphabet and all of the other kinds of communication technologies that we have now. Okay, so I think part of what I'm trying to suggest is that it's a very complex argument where I'm trying to say that, again, nature itself. See, Matt, it was Matt gave this video where he was talking about light, and he was saying, the light preceded life here on the planet, and to some extent, the photon makes the eye possible. That is, eyes emerged only because photons were already there. And to that extent, eyes are like a distant relative of the photon. And so he says, eyes are kind of like sight themselves in the natural world. And I see what he was saying. Part of me really, it was a beautiful metaphor, and I like it. to the extent that, Hans Jonas has some interesting stuff on the nobility of sight. There are interesting ways to come at it. But, your skin tans because of light. Photosynthesis is also occurring. So, I mean, there are different potentialities that photons have evolved. Life has evolved various potentialities to response to the orderliness that photons, or the ambiguous orderliness that photons are. But I think the point that I would try to say is, I think Matt was suggesting, I guess, something like the argument that you have to say consciousness itself was always part of the cosmos, rather than to say consciousness emerged, but emerged as a kind of logical, I don't want to say inevitability so much as it was a logical prerequisite and a logical possibility that now, given the fact, it couldn't have not been. I mean, we can look at it right here, but it wasn't that individually, again, we're struggling with this. I think individually we experience agency, we experience choice. One of the most dynamic, or most important features of being human is that slow and steady emergence to oneself that occurs over a long developmental period, but one slowly learns to become increasingly consciously aware of one's choices, gains greater senses of temporal expanses, greater sensibilities of the future and the past. And all of these, they're so subject to cultural variation and historical variation. But I think, the Stoic view is something like, there are some things under your power and there are other things not under your power. And the point is that you do have an experience of agency. You do have an experience of something like free choice. And you've been determined to have that. See, so it's a both-and situation, where it's not that you're either free or determined. No, nature determined that certain small localized pockets, that is, it evolved these little localized pockets of, at first, collective self-legislation, and then through various communication technologies, individual self-legislation. I mean, the notion of individuals, I guess, anonymously through money and literacy, shifting through, sort of functionally shifting through space and time, as with credit card, I guess, with various forms of advanced communication technologies, they've been enabled to free themselves from tribal lives, from dependency upon particular geographical limits. Most people throughout history were really limited in geography compared to people who live today with sort of modern communication technologies. And so I think that, the point is that to say that consciousness couldn't have not been, and to say that one's past couldn't be other than it is now that you've already done what you've done, it's not a predetermination. It's not a suggestion that you don't have any sense of agency or free will. I think the point is that it emerged, and even as it exists as it's a semi-autonomous function that we deal with by higher order strategies and to limited degrees, and it's never fully 100%. I think a better word is perhaps the management of constraints and passive constraints. The way that you can, through your very openness to the future, the way that you can anticipate what likely temptations or places, you can have certain goals where you maybe will, you avoid going to a certain grocery store that has food that's bad for you if you're trying to watch your diet, just as a very simple example. Now, it's not the surest thing that one can do, but there are ways that one can, again, try to make it more difficult for oneself to go in one direction rather than another. And it's sort of like breathing. Breathing is something that you can kind of consciously control. In fact, yogis can get very good at controlling their breathing and maybe inhale at a certain count and exhale at a certain count and get very meditative about it. But at a certain point, you forget about it, and your breath goes on its own autonomous accord. And I think that's sort of like our experience of agency. I think we do have great senses of it. I mean, and it's as if nature freed up a capacity for what we're going to call freedom. Now, what we call freedom has a lot to do with the kind of memory capacity we have and the imaginative capacity we have to collectively negotiate toward a future, to anticipate, I guess, likely outcomes from events. I think one of the major issues that I'm going to try to I've already shot a bunch of videos on them. I'll see if I can post some of the links to them here. I'll put a good number of links. I've shot so many videos on these in the past, but part of the real concern that I've had is, and I also talked about Darwinian evolution being true, and I want to stress there, when I say that Darwinian evolution is a fact, I'm not saying that it's the only fact that's relevant to understanding the cosmos or the human condition, right? I think we know that before the eukaryote invasion, there was a rule of life that was prior to what we're going to call evolution through natural selection. So, I mean, it's not even true for the first, I don't know, billion years of life. I mean, it's only the last 4 billion, 3.5 billion years that Darwinian selection would even make sense. So it's not that we're denying other forms of evolution. And even what I was going to say is, the issue is the difference between cultural evolution, and again, even the word is a little stretched there, and natural evolution. I mean, natural evolution, we can identify those processes of genetic inheritance and random variation, and then the kind of natural selection that goes on through survival value and adaptability to certain environmental conditions. That's so different, though, than, I guess, the kinds of exercise of agency between collective people who are imagining a future together. And there does, I think Anthony Wilden's work, I can't recommend enough to people. I don't, if people haven't seen his work, he's got so many good books. There's just one, Man, Woman, War and Peace. I don't know if I have some of his other stuff, but I think part of the argument would be that natural evolution is, again, roughly Darwinian, whereas cultural evolution it's more Lamarckian. It's more caught in younger generations seeing trajectories in the future, and it's, I think it has a greater recognition of the kind of teleology that, I guess, contemporary biological theory has largely abandoned. Now, if you take a concept like memes, which I've expressed my concern over before, memes as an expression seems to place agency where it's not, and this is partly maybe why I'm shouting this out to Matt here, why I have some reservations about the meme expression, because that wants to put agency where agency perhaps isn't, and it rhymes with gene. You're waiting for somebody with a white lab coat to come out. It sounds so scientific, and that itself, if that's what it's trying to illustrate, is that it's not always conscious how certain ideas gain ground, I guess, a capacity to, quotes, replicate themselves and disseminate themselves across people. I guess I would rather get into this question of what's under your control and what's not under your control, and to try to talk about those ranges of self-determination to the degree to which they're collectively and individually possible in humans. And so I'm going to see if I can. I know Fred and I have talked for a while. We're going to hopefully put up a video, I don't know, maybe next week sometime. We're going to do a dialogue on cultural evolution and natural evolution. I also have some other folks who I'm trying to set up some dialogues with. I want to see if I can't get more people talking about this question of what is the relationship between what we're going to call, evolutionary biology versus evolutionary psychology. That would be, one issue that I've talked about in the past. But, what are the differences between genetic research, epigenetic research, and then those areas that are they're not only stochastic in the sense of being sort of once occurrent processes, but they're also caught within the kinds of openness to the future that, for lack of a better word, we've been genetically determined to have. It's as if human memory and human imagination have conspired to create localized pockets within nature that experience agency, choice, and freedom, and it's never an absolute thing, right? It's always constrained in various ways by the physical conditions. It's constrained by environmental factors. There's always biological needs of the organism, and there are physical, I guess, again, just constraints on the organism. But if we deny all choice, it doesn't even make sense, because then you're saying you didn't even deny it. I mean, the language itself smuggles in the experience of choosing. And I don't think that, let's take I'm going to leave with one example, and maybe we can pick it up there, because I'm going to talk more about this in some subsequent videos and some dialogues. But it's the issue of anxiety is something that I would like to talk about. I know a lot of people feel anxiety, and anxiety arguably is genetic. It has a genetic basis that we can find predispositions to it in the organism, and yet there's a whole that's partly true, and we don't want to deny all that, but there's so much more about the socio-historical development of anxiety, how it related to the telegraph, how increasing information and increasing people's capacity to have information about distant places introduced within this organism a kind of anxiety that I don't want to say that we evolved anxiety as if it's an expression of natural evolution. I think that's, again, we could talk about it that way, but it's not like anxiety had survival value. I mean, I think you could try to talk about it that way. I think it's more as if that anxiety is the register of the freedom that we have, and that freedom had survival value. So humans came to experience themselves as open to the future and as open to choice. These new communication technologies have ushered in ranges of choice capacities to relate to a distant future with a kind of precision that's socially orchestrated and compounding interest and all kinds of other things. I mean, it's very complex to talk about, but all of those things conspiring together, they're creating anxiety. It's not a symptom simply of natural evolution, if by that we mean some expression of genes that now are expressing themselves because they had survival value. No, I think they're the runoff and the shadow sort of that's being cast from that organism that evolved into the kind, again, for lack of a better word, the experience of freedom that we have. Now, by freedom I mean those experiences of conscious choice, agency, those conscious decision-making that we do interpersonally, collectively, I mean both legally, but also just personally in our own lives. So please, if you have something to say to that, response to that, I'd really love to see some responses. Okay, thanks. Hope everyone is well.